This video was sponsored by Ground News. More from them in a bit. Ubisoft is dying. Their stock price ain't looking so good. There's been open calls from investors to just take the company private, and investors have only really been happy with the company when news came out that they were considering a buyout from Tencent. Now, there's been tons of exposés and articles written about what has gone wrong with Ubisoft. A lot of this is just kind of incompetence. Ubisoft was one of those companies that was trying to invest a lot into NFTs and Web3 and got burned badly. At one point, just a few years ago, apparently they had a dozen Battle Royale games in development. Hyperscape, one of the few Battle Royales they had, being shut down after a pretty underwhelming launch. The company never learned its lesson and now just seems to be moving on to extraction-based shooters, which is kind of the new trend in games. Things are not looking good, and things are probably not going to get better. But before Ubisoft completely dies out, I kind of just want to take a look at how we got here and why maybe we shouldn't mourn the death of this company. I check the news a lot. I like to see what's going on, you know? But if you only check one news site, only see one source, you're only gonna get one side of the story. And that's why I absolutely love Ground News. Ground News lets you see the political leaning and factuality of any given news source and who owns that media outlet. And you'll start to notice that this often dictates how a story is presented or even what stories are presented. So like if you haven't heard, in the United States, the Department of Justice is actually considering breaking up Google after they ruled it was a monopoly. Ground News has gathered 206 sources on this story, and while it's not clear what the fate of the company will be, it is interesting to see how each outlet covers the same event. Some right-leaning sources might mention specifically Biden's Justice Department and Google's defense of the situation, presenting this as some power move of government regulation, while left-leaning sources might mention anti-competitive behavior by the company and how this might be the byproduct of some monopolistic behavior. My personal favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot. This shows you specific stories that one side or the other just doesn't bother reporting on, and you'd be surprised how many pretty significant stories just get ignored. So try Ground News today and get 40% off the Vantage plan by going to ground.news/husk. So I think nowadays a lot of people remember Ubisoft as the company that tried to shove paid XP boosts into single player games. But if you go back like 20 years, people actually kind of liked Ubisoft. I mean, they weren't massive, they weren't nearly as prolific as Activision or EA, but with titles like the Rayman series, Tom Clancy franchise, and Prince of Persia, not to mention respected cult classics like Beyond Good and Evil, nobody could deny that Ubisoft wasn't leaving a mark on gaming. And for a brief time in that late 2000s, early 2010s, Ubisoft seemed to be striking a balance between being popular while also commanding a good deal of respect. Yes, you did have big names like the aforementioned Tom Clancy franchise or stuff like Assassin's Creed or Far Cry, but there was also games like Trackmania, the Driver series, the Trials franchise, or Rayman Origins. It sounds pretty cliche, but yeah, Ubisoft really did have something to offer pretty much everybody. But as time went on, this began to change. And it was because of money. Some of Ubisoft's franchises were getting way more popular, making way more money than they ever did before, and this changed the company. For example, Far Cry 2 sold 3 million copies, which is a respectable number, but Far Cry 3 sold 10 million copies. The first Assassin's Creed game was an immediate success. Within a few months, the game had sold 5 million units. But its successors, games like Assassin's Creed 2 and 3, they would sell more and more. Each new entry would pretty much sell 10 million units guaranteed. And this meant that Assassin's Creed would become an annualized franchise. Dozens of studios would work simultaneously on multiple projects to keep this machine going. Ubisoft struck gold with Far Cry and Assassin's Creed, but rather than remain content with this, they got greedy. Yeah, as the franchises got larger, more teams became involved, it did start feeling like each new entry was less so the byproduct of a creative vision, and rather the intentionally crafted product designed to appeal to the broadest demographic. Ubisoft takes the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, to the extreme. They take minimal chances and rely heavily on just doing what everybody else is doing and then iterating on those ideas. And this kind of makes sense. Ubisoft's projects are extremely large. They cost a lot of money to make, and it would be silly to take chances with this kind of money on the line. Or at least that's what I assume the executives were thinking. I like to view gaming publishers, or really any entertainment entity, as a giant ship. Now, on occasion, they'll encounter an obstacle and they'll have to try to maneuver around that to avoid crashing into the iceberg. But to do this, to steer around this, you can't just turn this giant boat, change direction on a dime. And what I mean by this is everything that's happening right now in Ubisoft is the byproduct of decisions they made 4, 5, 10 years ago. Every publisher has to make decisions like this because games take so long to develop nowadays. But Ubisoft lacks the foresight to make good decisions. Ubisoft just keeps chasing trends in the industry as they are happening. I'm sure that Hyperscape could have been an effective Warzone or Apex Legends competitor, but it was released too late. Because rather than create trends, Ubisoft chases them. And as time has gone on, Ubisoft just stopped investing in its smaller franchises. They've only made each new project more ambitious, more expensive. And when we look back, it's clear that this just has not been working out. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit before, but yeah, Star Wars Outlaws apparently only sold about 1 million copies since launch. This is really bad when you consider that Star Wars Outlaws apparently had the largest marketing budget of any Ubisoft game ever. We don't know the exact budget on this game, but it was probably a few hundred million. So only selling 1 million copies is terrible. In fact, analysts had expected at one point for this thing to sell 7.5 million copies, and then they lowered it to 5.5 million, and it's not even close to that. Now, this game kind of represents everything wrong with Ubisoft. Players that paid like $110 to get the game early access by 3 days, a lot of them had to just reset their game because there were game-breaking bugs that would ruin their saves. Imagine paying this much money for a game that you're probably pretty excited for and then having your experience ruined because of incompetence, because of a bug, because they didn't check to see if this worked. Skull and Bones. Remember Skull and Bones? Yeah, they called it their first quadruple A game. Apparently only had less than 1 million players total, including the free trial players. The game was in development for a decade, probably cost around $200 million to make. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time remake, that was announced a while back. This was going to be the first project helmed by Ubisoft's branch in India, but apparently this was a complete disaster. Sources claim that Ubisoft just didn't bother to give the team the original documentation, which would mean they actually have to remake it from scratch. Because of the use of a new engine, they were just going to shove in Assassin's Creed Origins animations. The director of the game just didn't work on a game before this. Ubisoft higher-ups didn't really know or care much about this project at all. They didn't know about this. The company didn't know about this or care about this until there was a terrible reception to this initial trailer. So they were just throwing money at this project without knowing what they were throwing money at. Earlier this year, Ubisoft was just taking the game, the crew, away from people that bought it because they were shutting down the servers. And even though it's primarily a single-player game, it can be played in single-player. Since it's always online, it just meant that people that bought this game would simply not be able to play it anymore. And when people found out they couldn't play their game anymore, Ubisoft just told them, hey, go buy more stuff that you probably won't be able to keep in 10 years. The game X-Defiant, which was at one point Tom Clancy's X-Defiant before it was rebranded, apparently is not doing that well. Reportedly, there was less than 20,000 concurrent players across all platforms, which is absurdly low. That number might even be pretty high. It might be way lower than 20K. For a live service game, this is pretty much dead. It's just dead. Ubisoft has had a lot of controversies over the past decade or so. I mean, there's been constant accusations of graphical downgrades, from E3 showcases to final products, from Watch Dogs. There's The Division. The initial gameplay for Rainbow Six Siege looks nothing like the final game. I mean, it's embarrassing. Former executives were straight up arrested after sexual harassment investigations. There's been allegations that Ubisoft knew all about this, that this was commonplace within the company, and that people were protected just because of their position in the company. So yeah, it's an understatement to say that Ubisoft has lost a lot of its goodwill from its fan base. And things have honestly gotten so bad that the entire fate of the company seems to hinge on the new upcoming Assassin's Creed game. So like I said, the Assassin's Creed franchise is probably the most important franchise for Ubisoft. Each game does sell extremely well, but at some point the publisher realized that it wasn't necessarily just the gameplay that was making these titles so successful. It was just the name. For the first decade of this franchise's existence, it was a fairly linear single-player action-adventure stealth series. Yeah, there was kind of an open world to explore, but the focus was primarily on the main story. But all this changed with Assassin's Creed Origins, a soft reboot of sorts for the series. Now it was a full open-world action RPG, and future entries would build upon this, completely changing the core identity of the franchise. Now this was an extremely controversial move to OG Assassin's Creed fans, but these new action RPG games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Odyssey and Valhalla actually sold really well, sometimes better than even the traditional titles. Anyway, while Ubisoft still does on occasion do the old style of Assassin's Creed games with stuff like Mirage, this open world action RPG stuff is the new direction of the franchise. And going forward, it seems like Ubisoft is only going to increase its reliance on the Assassin's Creed brand, with 10 games planned to release over the next 5 years. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the fate of Ubisoft relies on the success of Assassin's Creed Shadows, which has been the subject of some controversies. If you haven't heard anything about this, I envy you. Okay, it all started as a response to one of the playable characters in the game, Yasuke, and this whole online debate, this battle, is extremely dense and way more complicated than you probably think. Yes, of course, there's going to be lots of people making really bad faith arguments, but there's also been like an uproar in the Japanese community over westernizing Japanese culture. There's been debates over the historical accuracy of whether the real-life Yasuke was actually a samurai, or whether Ubisoft is paying consultants to like gaslight people into thinking he was. Ubisoft themselves have handled this situation terribly, with employees making bizarre, very antagonistic statements. And there seems to be a lot of evidence that the publisher is straight up buying bots to leave positive praise on official YouTube trailers for the game. I could go into detail about all of this, but I won't, because it doesn't really matter. Look, this will not affect the sales of this game, not in any significant way. We already know that pre-orders are lower than Valhalla, but that's to be expected since this is a game that's not releasing on last-gen platforms, whereas that game had the benefit of this. Look, this is not a new property. This is a franchise with extremely broad appeal. It will sell well, but the question is whether it's going to sell well enough to save Ubisoft. The title was delayed from an initially planned release in November all the way back to February of 2025. Now, the reasons for this have been up to debate. The CEO of Ubisoft came out and said that the company had no intention of pushing any agenda, which led some people to believe that this delay was in response to, you know, some culture war growing backlash, but it almost definitely wasn't. Like, look, I'm sure if they're delaying the game and even concerned about that, concerned enough to make a quote, they would probably be removing any politically divisive, I don't know, lines of dialogue. But yeah, they're not going to remove one of the main character of the games a few months before release because of internet backlash. That's just not how game development works. That doesn't even make sense. No, the game was delayed because of something that will definitely affect sales: the quality of the title. Apparently, it's not finished. Yes, I know that's not all that surprising given Ubisoft's track record, but we've known that something has been off about this game for a while. Like, look at this horse animation in the official trailer for the game. It's clearly unfinished, yet again, somehow this made it to the official trailer for the game. Apparently, the developers of the game have been begging Ubisoft to push this game back for a while now. And it wasn't until the absolute failure of Star Wars Outlaws that the company realized that they had to do this. It had to be done. And I think the reason for this is because gamers seem to actually care about quality now. Hear me out. A lot more people are playing free-to-play stuff nowadays than they were 10 years ago. Yes, that has its own set of issues, but it also means that consumers are becoming much more reluctant to just spend money on a full-price game. They're becoming much more picky about what they choose to spend their money on. And if a game is not good, if a game is not great, people are gonna either wait for a sale or won't buy it at all. To guarantee success, your game has to be exceptional. Public perception, word of mouth, that's what results in a successful title. But even still, I don't know if it's gonna sell that well. I think releasing this game in February is dumb. It's really dumb. I think the reason they're doing this is because they want to be able to tell investors during the end of the fiscal year how well this game performed. Show off how strong the Assassin's Creed franchise is doing. If I had to guess, I'd say February 2025 is probably the latest they can push this game back and still be able to do that. But the problem is this month is packed with games. You have Avowed, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Civilization 7, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii. There's a lot of stuff to play, but honestly, I think just Monster Hunter Wilds alone is gonna be a legitimate threat to this game. Monster Hunter has gone from a popular franchise to a mega popular franchise. Monster Hunter World sold more copies than any Assassin's Creed ever. And I'm certain that these games, all of these games, this extremely packed month, it's gonna eat into Assassin's Creed Shadows sales. And even if that wasn't the case, this game still probably wouldn't save Ubisoft. Investors have already lost faith in the company. They seem to want a buyout, a change in management, a change in direction, because the company is just falling apart. Yeah, 10, 15 years ago, Ubisoft did have a lot of potential, and all of that was wasted through extremely greedy and short-sighted decisions. They've taken the Ubisoft name and turned it into something of a red flag, something that people actively avoid when buying games. They failed to innovate and turned their games into nothing more than products. And honestly, I feel like this is just one of those situations that everybody knew was coming. You cannot have a company fail this many times, this much, this consistently, and expect them to still stay around. So yeah, if the company goes private or gets acquired by Tencent, it probably won't result in better games, but I don't think a lot of people will really care either way. At least in my opinion, Ubisoft died a long time ago. And this just feels like somebody is claiming the body. They should have made another Rayman game. That would have saved them. Again, huge thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. They're doing great work over there, and right now you can get 40% off the Vantage plan by going to ground.news/husk.